Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, October 5th, 2022, and just 1 month until the midterm elections, President Biden has confided in a secret White House meeting in a moment acquired by the mainstream media, which reveals that President Biden intends to run for re-election this upcoming presidential election in 2024. Now, to some people, this comes as not a surprise the slightest, largely because President Biden, as a sitting incumbent, serves to be the Democratic Party's most reliable chance at winning re-election this upcoming presidential election. While that may be seen as something that is not necessarily the best news for the Democratic Party on the front of incumbency and the factor that plays in presidential elections, it certainly seems to be an important one that if I was to look at it from the Democratic perspective, I would not turn down the opportunity for President Biden to run again. But on the other hand, there are voters and there are candidates and there are politicians and everyone associated with American politics who believe that President Biden simply should not run for re-election, or they doubt his ability to do so. Issues of his health and old age were brought up as concern in 2020, though Donald Trump, being nearly his age, also seemed to receive similar treatment when it came down to the expectations and the reliability of a president to be able to serve out their full term. Not only would President Biden be considered about his ability to serve out his full term, but also the possibility that he may not be able to serve it out through 2028. An entire 8-year term, or 8-year total time in the presidency, a 2-term president, something that people simply don't want to really understand. Looking at the 2024 election in a nutshell, right now you have the Republican Party, which starts out in a pretty strong advantage when it comes down to the presidential election. About 55 cents for a Republican share, 46 cents for a Democratic share. And, looking at the odds over time, things have been pretty consistent in favor of the Republican Party. Looking at the Democrats previously, it was more neck and neck, but that simply has no longer been the case. I think right now what I take away most from the betting odds is that the expectation at default is that the GOP does win, but that Democrats still have a somewhat possibility at turning this race around. But based off of what we've seen in terms of election data, that probably only lies with President Biden. Looking at the 2024 odds as well for who wins the actual election, you find Joe Biden at 24 cents, Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump combined at 52 cents for a yes share. That makes sense to the extent that it adds up to where the Republicans are when it comes down to the overall spread, but it shows that even as the incumbent president, he doesn't start out as the favorite. Looking at the numbers also, just for the polling data that we have seen for 2024, President Biden seems to be polling sometimes well and sometimes not so well when it comes down to individual races and matchups between President Trump and President Biden. North Carolina, Biden is ahead by 2. Oregon, Biden is ahead by 9. Washington, Biden is ahead by 10. And in 2 of these states, it's quite impressive that Biden has this lead. But then you understand that these states are states that voted for him by double digits in the last election. But then North Carolina comes in out of nowhere. You're seeing a 4 to 5 point reduction across Oregon and Washington. And yet the state of North Carolina, which voted for Trump by a singular point in 2020, 3 points in 2016, is going to Biden by 2 points, according to this poll. I don't know if I entirely trust that, though. President Biden has seen a reduction in support from the 2020 election, and it has resulted in losses in a number of these polls in other states. For instance, in Pennsylvania, Trump beats Biden by 1. In Missouri, Trump beats Biden by 14. In Texas, Trump beats Biden by 9. Joe Biden and Donald Trump were in a 6-point race following the election results in 2020 in Texas. So looking at other polls as well, what do you find? Colorado, Biden plus 10 seems strong for a swing state, but then you remember Donald Trump lost this state by 13.5% in the last election. Florida, Trump beats Biden by 3. That's a 2020 type of margin. Wisconsin, Biden leads by 1. That's good. But then in North Carolina, Trump's winning by 5. In Ohio, Trump's winning by 10. Improvements from 2020. And New Hampshire shows Biden ahead by about 3 points across the entire state itself, when in reality he won by 7 in 2020, and Hillary Clinton in fact won it back in 2016. So this reduction in support has been pretty universal. Beyond a few outlier polls, President Biden does not seem to be the most electable Democrat for 2024, but in that same tune, he is also the most electable Democrat for 2024, and I'll give you a bit of my reasoning behind that. Looking at the 2024 presidential nomination, we have seen many people consider the possibility that Joe Biden does not decide to run for office. And if that was to be true, the immediate person that the media, the mainstream Democrats, superdelegates, whatever it might be, the establishment, in essence, would turn to Vice President Kamala Harris. Similar to how Al Gore ran for this position back in 2000, he won that nomination with ease because he was treated as an incumbent. President Biden was not treated as an incumbent, though, in 2016 and 2020, and that may be something that we take into consideration should the event come up that President Biden is not, in fact, running against what he has been practically saying on the national level, what the White House has been putting out, that he has ultimately decided against that. Should that be true, the immediate frontrunner would be Kamala Harris, but there is still a possibility that they treat her the way that they treated Biden, and not as an incumbent, but rather just as a normal candidate, which might invite more people into the race. But there certainly is a factor of the incumbency that makes a major play. If President Biden was to run again in 2024 and someone tried to challenge him, realistically, they would not win that primary victory. They would not win that primary election. We have never seen a point in time in American history where an incumbent sitting president has lost a nationwide primary. And the reason why that might be is because incumbency is a super, super significant factor. Looking at past elections, looking at upcoming elections, looking at congressional elections, whatever it might be, incumbency is a benefit and not a detriment unless, and in some circumstances it can be a detriment, unless you are so unpopular that voters view your incumbency as a negative. But by the time we reach November 2024, President Biden has the opportunity in a very similar way to how President Trump did it at recovering his nationwide approval rating. Right now, Biden is in the single digits when it comes down to overall net negative. Just 2 months ago, he was down 21 points nationwide. If that's not an improvement, I don't know what is. And President Biden, quite frankly, has 2 more years for an overall improvement. And looking at the numbers that we have seen decided between the Democrats and Republicans for 2022, we have seen a turnaround, and it's happening right now. Looking at the numbers between Democrats and Republicans on the front of January, February, March, Republicans had maintained the lead. And this is what I think could be in the future for President Biden as we see him get closer to the 2024 election. A turnaround in favor of the Democratic Party. To be quite fair, President Trump was never going to win the presidential election during the height of the pandemic back in 2020, was never going to win the presidential election during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020. And when that was happening, you saw the numbers come out against President Trump, negative in approval, negative in chances at winning the presidency, negative in statewide polls, and that reflected to, guess what? Just a 44,000 vote loss on Election Day. While President Biden was the benefactor of these polls that, at least in the polls that overestimated Democratic support, it could work on the flip side in 2024. And I will also say that just because a president is unpopular doesn't mean that they are doomed for re-election. That's what I constantly have to remind myself about this. President Biden being the incumbent is enough to bump him up to a point where voters will vote for him simply because he is the incumbent. It's not the majority of voters, but there are a certain group out there that will see incumbency only as a positive, see the status quo only as a positive. On top of that, President Biden comes in without a contentious primary. No matter who runs in 2024, there will be a contentious primary. And honestly, the best news for President Biden on this front is that Donald Trump may in fact be the presidential nominee for 2024, which means we are in a rematch of 2020. And if President Biden defeated President Trump before, he can absolutely do it again. It does, become less and less likely as Biden's approval rating does deteriorate, but honestly, it has been pretty steady recently. And if he can get it up and up, it will honestly improve him enough to a point where we could realistically see him win re-election. I'm bringing up the numbers from President Obama too to show you what the approval rating was for President Obama when he won re-election back in 2012. President Obama was approved of by just 3 points nationwide during the time of the election. There was a very clear correlation between the approval rating of the president and the disapproval rating of the president and the national popular vote for Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. Obama won the popular vote by a smaller margin than what Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump in 2020 when it came down to the overall spread. President Biden outperformed many Democratic contenders from the past on the national popular vote. But looking at the approval rating of President Biden at the time, he was approved of or favored because there was no approval, but rather a favorability rating of about +7. Today, his favorability rating is about -8. But what I'm trying to show you with these 2012 numbers is that approval rating truly is not everything. If it was, and you saw the reduction between Obama's approval rating in 2008 versus where it was in 2012, you would expect it to be a landslide for Mitt Romney. President Obama started his presidency being approved of 42 points more than he was disapproved of across the nation. At a different point in time, President Obama had 64% of the nation on his side in terms of overall approval, 66% when you look at its peak. And by the time he finished in 2016, he was approved of with 57% of the nation and 18-point net approval for President Obama. The numbers on themselves in terms of approval are not enough to dictate or predict a presidency. In November 2016, when Hillary Clinton lost her election, President Obama was approved of nationwide by 9 points. Hillary Clinton, in every regard, was Barack Obama's successor. And if she lost the election while Obama was up by 9, tells you again everything you need to know about the president's approval rating and its impact on an election. Looking at 2010, a year in which the Republican Party picked up 63 seats in the House of Representatives, President Obama was disapproved of by 4 points nationwide. Just 4 points. And yet today, President Biden is down by about 10 points nationwide, yet seems to be holding on strong to the Democrats in the House and Senate elections, where they have a realistic possibility at keeping both chambers when the majority for the Democrats in the Senate is 0 and the majority for the Republicans is 4. For context, in 2010, when Republicans flipped the House chamber, the Democrats had a 59-41 advantage in the Senate and a 254 seat share in the House of Representatives for the Democrats. The Republican Party had their biggest pickups in decades, 63 seats, with an approval rating of just -4. So with President Biden being at 10, again, we would assume, -10, we would assume on this front that 2022 is an automatic blowout. But unfortunately for the Republican Party, that does not seem to be the case. President Biden's approval rating matters, but not to the extent that we think it does. And if President Biden is to run again in 2024, as these numbers do indicate, he serves to be the Democratic Party's most reliable chance at victory on the simple fact that he is an incumbent. This is not some type of Hillary Clinton race. I've seen some people make that comparison. And one thing that fundamentally differs Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden is that he won his election. He flipped the Rust Belt back. He won in Arizona for the first time for Democrats since 1992 or 1996, one of those two. It was the Bill Clinton era. Same thing in Georgia. I think Georgia might have been 92. Arizona was 96. I'm assuming that's correct because that's what I remember from my maps. But looking at that, seeing President Biden's impact on the future of American elections for Democrats and Republicans, I am reminded that in 2020, he was a strong candidate. And he absolutely can return to being that. Because just in the way that I told you that a president's approval rating and favorability rating can change, it did for President Biden. When you take a look at where it stood before the November election, you will find that he was overall in the negative. He was not doing well in the time of August and June and July of 2020. At that point in time, he was averaging in the negatives. But then the Democratic Party pushed for an ad switch. They pushed for a campaign that made President Biden seem very positive. The DNC was focused on making him a family man. The ads that were being put out weren't negative towards Trump to the same extent that they were being positive towards Biden. They were being very, very pro-Biden. They were being very positive in their depiction of him as a candidate. And by the time we reached the election, these negatives turned into positives. And on Election Day, President Biden had a net favorability rating of about 7 to 8 points nationwide. 7 to 8 points nationwide at the same time that President Trump was down by about 8 points. A 16-point net difference, one that as someone who sees this from the perspective of an analyst, from the perspective of someone who looks at it, understanding how the election went, this did have some type of impact, but not fully. I think it matters, but it doesn't end a campaign, nor does it start one. You could win or lose, regardless of your favorability rating, unfavorability rating, whatever it might be. But together, what I see from these numbers and from President Biden's own internal announcement, whether public or not, even though the White House has been saying that he intends to run for re-election, is that President Biden still has a chance in 2024, and to write him off now would be naive. and completely understanding and show a lack of understanding of the way American politics works. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.